Breaking news. Putin's war in Ukraine keeps paying off, but not for him. Russia's powerful mercenary fighting force, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a protege of Russian President Vladimir, turned on the Russian military and, ostensibly, the Kremlin on June 23, 2023, 16 months into Russia's war with Ukraine. However, Prigozhin turned his troops around and abandoned the march to Moscow within the span of a day. Putin's plans to forcibly subjugate Ukraine were damaged, and his strongman image suffered as a result. Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, came out of the blue. Russia saw no immediate threat from NATO. But Putin and his closest advisors saw Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia's great power ambitions if the West armed and allied with it. And while Ukraine isn't a member of NATO just yet, Putin sees the alliance as already present in his country. The immediate goal of Putin's adventure, according to most Western pundits and analysts, was to overthrow the Kyiv government and establish some form of Russian control over this massive neighbor. To the contrary, Putin was successful in achieving every outcome he had hoped to avoid: a robust, unified NATO response in defense of Ukraine, a unified, nationally conscious, fiercely anti-Russian Ukrainian response to the invasion, and a catastrophic loss of Russian men and material. Russia's major 2023 battlefield victory over the city of Bakhmut would not have been possible without the Wagner Group, led by former Putin confidant Prigozhin. Putin's pursuit of the war has been further complicated by a mutiny staged by Prigozhin and his mercenary force over the weekend. He appears to be in worse shape than before, and Russia's most capable fighting force in its aggression against Ukraine has been wiped out. As far as Ukrainian nationalism is concerned, Putin has done more than the 19th-century poet Taras Shevchenko. And in the same ways that the Russian leader has bolstered Ukraine, he has weakened Russia. Hundreds of thousands of Russians from all walks of life left the country soon after his invasion of Ukraine. To counter public opposition to the war after the mass exodus, the Kremlin resorted to censorship, false narratives, and increased coercion and repression. In 2023, on June 23 and 24, Prigozhin, formerly the Kremlin's caterer, mutinied and began a march on Moscow to replace the leadership of the regular Russian army, highlighting the fragile and fragmented nature of the Russian state. Prigozhin had been complaining openly about the way the Russian military was being led in the weeks leading up to the mutiny. However, within a day, the attempted coup had failed. Putin's fiery speech denouncing the mutineers as traitors to the fatherland and promising severe punishment convinced Prigozhin to accept exile in Belarus. A bloody civil war was averted thanks to Moscow's promise of no further retaliation. After the mutiny, many Western geopolitical experts claimed that Putin had been weakened. Antony Blinken, the current Secretary of State of the United States, has taken note of the schisms in the Russian government but has been hesitant to make any predictions about the country's future. The U.S. government refrained from making any further comments, fearing that doing so would imply some sort of complicity with the events in Russia. Some people may even come to view Putin as the astute peacemaker who stopped bloodshed between Russians. You should not discount him. I think the U.S. government should weigh its own interests against the uncertainty of the situation in Russia, especially in light of the recent coup and subsequent collapse. Putin's removal from office would likely lead to an end to hostilities in Ukraine, though Russia would likely retain de facto control of Crimea due to the peninsula's unique status. Until Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine in 1954, Crimea, which had been taken from the Ottomans and local Tatars by Catherine the Great, was a part of Russia. Any Russian government would have a hard time returning the peninsula to Ukraine because Russians see it as an ancient patrimony of Russia. In recent years, the United States has pursued the goals of regime change in Moscow and a weakened Russia, which poses a security threat to Europe and the former Soviet states due to its size and location. It's hard to picture a stable international system that includes the current Russian regime, which Putin has successfully made a pariah of. US and NATO are invested in Ukraine's success. The United States and NATO are willing to make material sacrifices to ensure a Ukrainian victory in this war. NATO leaders are optimistic that Ukraine will be given a significant role in the security structure of the post-war European order as compensation for the country's citizens' efforts to achieve independence and sovereignty. It remains to be seen if that will lead to formal membership in NATO. How to handle Ukraine's relationship with Russia is a key factor in the strategic calculations necessary for a post-war settlement. It seems unlikely that the parties can return to the terms of the Minsk II agreement, which called for a neutral Ukraine and a federal relationship with the Donbass. Russia may not accept defeat in the war if it is forced to withdraw from much of the territory it occupies in Ukraine. Would Russia be made to compensate Ukraine for the harm it has caused there? That would be morally correct, but it wouldn't be enforceable unless the aggressor was completely wiped out. The addition of Russia's nuclear weapons further muddles the picture. It's impossible to predict whether or not a humiliated and defeated Russia would resort to nuclear weapons. There could be peace talks after the mutiny. I believe there is a utopian solution, one that is practical if not easy to implement. Putin may be willing to reconsider Russia's participation in the war now that the Prigozhin mutiny has weakened the country's military. It would be a good first step toward negotiations and a compromise that could end the war if both sides agreed to an immediate ceasefire. From Ukraine's vantage point, a compromise could involve Russian forces being withdrawn from the country, aside from Crimea, Russia making reparations for the damage they've caused, and the West promising to help rebuild the country. A new international security structure may be discussed, but before that, Russia may demand international guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO but would be free to become a member of the European Union. As a result of adopting such a framework, countries like Russia, China, and India, among others, could join a cooperative system that protects national boundaries. This piece was originally published on The Conversation, a non-profit platform for exchanging ideas between academics. What do you think of this article?